왜 그런 더 이상 갈 데 없는 골목에 부딪히면 폭발이 일어나는 거지?
That was the culmination, I guess you could say. Culmination of I don't know. Tremendous energy is tied up in our egoic identities. And when it's suddenly released, if it gets released all at once, it can feel like an explosion of energy.
그러니까 왜 그때 나는 모른다 하면 에너지가 방출되냐 이 말이야. 그러니까 나는 모른다에 묶여있던 에너지가 폭발한다는 거 아니야. 왜 모른다에서 에너지 폭발로 이어지냐 이 말이지. 그럼 폭발하는 그 에너지는 어디서 생겼냐 이 말이야. That energy was from where?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that energy, it's already there, but it's that energy is it takes a tremendous energy to keep supporting our separate identities. It takes a lot of energy to do that. So as soon as we go beyond that ego, all of that energy is suddenly released. Right? It's released to the system. Every awakening will have some amount of energetic component. Every awakening has some amount of energetic release of energy that I've ever seen.
반갑습니다.
Nice to meet you too.
네, yeah. 저는 한국의 지금여기라는 잡지를 만들고 있는 이원규라고 하고 있습니다.
Nice to meet you, Lee. You're the publisher. Wonderful.
당신의 책이 국내에서 출간된 것은 우리 잡지 회원 중에 한 분이 처음으로 번역을 해서 출간을 했습니다.
Mm-hmm. Which book is it?
End of the World.
Okay. Yeah.
그 전에 우리 잡지에 사실 기사를 한번 소개했었습니다.
Nice to hear.
예, 그래서 한국에 당신이 소개된 것은 우리 잡지가 좀 힘을 발휘했다고 생각을 하고 있습니다.
That's really, really wonderful. It's nice to hear that one of my books is published in Korean. I wasn't even aware of it. I don't follow it that closely, but it's really nice to hear. And so I'm really happy to do this interview with you.
오케이, 오늘 그 인터뷰의 주된 내용은 당신이 이 깨달음이라는 또는 illuminate라는 그 과정을 수행하고 발견하는 그 부분에 있어서 핵심되는 측면만 좀 질문을 하려고 합니다.
Yeah. Okay.
에센스라고 말하는 의미는 변화되기 이전과 변화된 이후 전환점이 되는 부분, 그 부분에 대해서 주로 질문을 드리고 싶은데 왜 그러냐면 일반 사람들은 그 변화되기 이전에 있다고 한다면 변화된 이후에 대해서는 알지 못할 거고 그렇지만 그 변화되기 이전과 이후의 그 중간 부분, 즉 새벽과 같은 부분, 어둠과 빛이 있다면 어둠에서 빛으로 바뀌는 그 새벽과 같은 지점은 일반인들도 분명히 와닿는 부분이 있을 거라고 생각되기 때문에 그 부분에 대해서 중점적으로 질문을 드릴 거고 당신 인생에 있어서 그런 전환점, 여러 가지 전환점이 있었을 거라고 보는데 그 부분을 중점적으로 질문을 하려고 합니다.
Okay. Yeah. I hope it ends up being official.
Okay. 그 새벽과 같은 지점이 중요한 것은 바로 직접적으로 피부에 와닿을 부분이 있을 거라고 여기기 때문이다.
Yeah. Well, I think all beings have a sort of intuitive desire, I guess you could say, to awaken to a broader perspective, you know, whether they're religious or spiritual or not spiritual, that desire to come into a realization of a bigger perspective. I think that's part of what that but that dawn experience, kind of, and using the metaphor of dawn, I think is really quite useful because it is kind of like a light turning on, a different quality of awareness that's always there in potential, all of a sudden becomes activated. It goes from potential to becoming actualized, and that's the moment where, of course, life looks very, very different after that moment. I'd be happy to describe that moment if you think it would be useful.
오케이. 네, 그러면 본격적인 질문으로 들어갈 텐데, 먼저 당신이 말하는 깨어남, 깨달음이라는 것은 어떤 겁니까? 무엇입니까?
Yeah.
What is it?
Well, there's lots of different ways that you could describe this, but the context that I like to talk about it in is it's a realization, it's an awakening from, first of all, we know what are we awakening from and what are we awakening to. So you awaken from the sort of culturally imposed identity that we have of who we are and what we are. And that's always is defined by, in every culture, probably a great degree of separation. The experience of being other than others, other than the world. That's, I think, the normal, what we think of as the normal state of being. With awakening, we realize that is literally what we wake up from the perspective of separation, because separation is ultimately simply a perspective. It's one way of viewing the world. And what we awaken to is our true nature, by whatever word, however we want to describe that, whether it's true nature or Buddha nature, or, there's lots of ways of describing it, but it's a way of experiencing our own being to no longer be separate from the rest of existence. That's a simplified way of talking about it. And probably also one of our biggest barriers to that awakening, one of the things that gets in our way the most, is the belief that it's difficult and that it's rare. And as soon as we believe that this kind of awakening is a very rare thing, then that belief makes it much more difficult to happen. But as soon as we open up to the possibility that it doesn't necessarily need to be rare, neither does it need to inherently be difficult, that these are just sort of culturally induced belief systems about awakening. Mm-hmm. What I find is when people can let go of those two beliefs, that it's rare and that it requires tremendous difficulty, then the awakening becomes much, much, much more available to them.
오케이. 그러면 이 과정을 일반적으로 거치는 사람이 좀 사실은 많지는 않은데 언제부터 여기에 대한 추구가 시작됐습니까?
I started my seeking at about 20 years old. And it came as a surprise when I was reading a book on Zen Buddhism, just sort of exploring what it was all about. And I read about the word of enlightenment, and quite literally, when I read the word enlightenment, I had no idea what that word meant. It wasn't a word that I was ever that interested in. But for some reason, when I read it in the book, this word enlightenment, it was almost like some sort of internal explosion went off. And all of a sudden, like snapping your fingers, all of a sudden I had to know what enlightenment was. It just it was a very odd experience. One minute I'm just going about my day like a regular person, and then I read about enlightenment, and all of a sudden I need to know, I have to know what that is. With every cell in my being. Why it occurred that way, I don't actually know. I couldn't really say why it rose so quickly and so powerfully, so mysterious.
왜 궁금증이 생겼는지를 말할 수 없다는 것은 어떤 본능적인 욕구였던 것 같습니까? 뭘까요, 그건?
Yeah, I think there is something intuitive about it. I'm just trying to find a way to express what I want to express. I think it is a kind of an awakening of a kind of intuition. Also, because my spiritual search, unlike a lot of people's, I think most people's spiritual search is in some way a reaction to suffering, not wanting to suffer. But that wasn't really what motivated me, because I really wasn't suffering much in my life at that time. So it wasn't about not wanting to suffer. That's why it was so mysterious, because I can't really say that there was a causal relationship to something I was experiencing and why all of a sudden I had this deep and profound spiritual desire. But also at that point in my life, I also was I was beginning to realize that me, like everybody else in life, that my life was going to have impact on everybody around me. And I also had a deep desire for that impact to be as positive as it could be. And so that kind of was part of the desire too, to be able to manifest in my life as much sanity, and wisdom or love that I could. So that was part of the motivation as well.
Okay. 자, 그러면 그 깨어나는 과정에서 획기적인 전환점이 몇 시점이 있었을 것 같은데, 그런 어떤 몇 가지 시점이 좀 있었습니까? 몇 가지 전환점이 있었습니까?
It's difficult to answer, but I would say there was lots of small shifts along the way, many small shifts, and there was probably two or three really big shifts, massive shifts, which the first one was at 25 years old, and the second one was probably at about 30, 31 or 32 years old. They were both sort of, completely life-changing shifts of consciousness. So two really big ones, and then lots of smaller moments as well.
Okay. 22살 때 전환점에서는 무슨 일이 벌어졌습니까?
Sure. Before I describe, I just want to say that, each person has their own unique way of having these kind of openings. So I wouldn't want someone to think that they have to have exactly, go through the exact same experience I had. So I just want to say that as a preempt to my story, I guess you'd say. So for me, when I was 25, this desire for enlightenment was very, very, very intense. The question of what was ultimately true, what was ultimately real was I can't really convey how powerful that question was living inside of me. In a very, 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 very powerful way. I was meditating generally many hours a day, and one day I just sat down and I was really deeply desiring to have some sort of breakthrough. And I was just sat down to meditate. Something very, very deep inside me realized that I couldn't do this, that I just didn't know how to have this breakthrough. It was kind of like a moment of profound defeat. Mm-hmm. And I said to myself, I can't do this. And as soon as I said to myself, I can't do this, it was as if an energetic explosion went off in my body. It was just an explosion of energy that was so overwhelming and so intense that I was quite certain that it was going to kill me. It was so powerful. And to make a long story short, at some moment, I just surrendered to it. And I really did think it was going to kill me. It was so powerful. So it was almost violent. The energy was so strong. And as soon as I just surrendered to it, and I really thought I was going to die at that moment, as soon as I surrendered to it, like snapping my fingers, I was in a whole other sort of dimension of being. It was kind of like being completely outside of the body. And I mean, one could talk on and on and on about it, of course, but essentially what I realized was what I came back from that experience knowing and experiencing and feeling was that what I was essentially was something that was timeless and without limits. And that's not just true for me, that it was ultimately true for everybody, whether they knew it or not. But there was something in our true nature was timeless and limitless, something without form or shape.
아니 지금 좌선을 하면서 이게 이래갖고는 안 되는구나 이런 것을 알고서 그 다음에 무슨 일이 벌어졌길래 에너지 폭발이 일어난 거지?
One way of talking about that is, I think the I can't do this was really the ego surrendering. That's really what was happening. It was completely letting go, the surrendering, and it was a very sort of literal death experience. I very did much feel like I was dying, or that in some way I did have a death experience. And so I think, when we start our spiritual practice, whether we know it or not, our ego is trying to have the breakthrough. Our ego is doing whatever we're doing. That's the only thing we have to work with. And I think however we come about it, at some point, that ego has to realize that it can't, in and of itself, cause a breakthrough to happen. That it ultimately just has to let go. It has to surrender. And I think the experience was so powerful for me, so overwhelming, because my ego was pushing so hard, Your
ego was pushing so hard.
So hard to have to go through.
So
when it surrendered, it was such a, it was a release of all that effort, all that struggle, all that striving.
그 서렌더라는 것은 뭘 의미하는지.
Letting go. Complete defeat. Total defeat.
내가 할 수 있는 건 없다 이런 뜻인가?
It's a good question. No, it doesn't mean there's nothing you can do. It means there's no direct causal relationship between what we do or our spiritual practice and awakening. But that doesn't mean that there is no relationship. It's just not directly causal. Like there's no equation that says if you do this, this, and this, then it will equal enlightenment. There's nothing that's directly causal in that sense. So in that sense, the ego can't make it happen. However, even though there's not a direct cause and effect relationship between what we do and awakening, that doesn't mean there's no relationship. There is a relationship. it's just indirect. So our efforts, our intention, whatever our spiritual practice is, does have a profound effect. It's just that we can't dictate what that effect is. The effect is more indirect than it is direct. So it's kind of a paradox, isn't it? That we have to exercise, I think, great intention and back that intention up by what we do. But at the same time, we have to also realize that we can't manufacture awakening in and of itself. It's in a certain sense, it's also a grace. So it's a real paradox. And also, I also think there's something else that most people miss, which is that the very desire for, let's say, awakening or enlightenment, the desire itself, the yearning itself, is the arising of the energy of enlightenment. The desire for enlightenment comes from the arising of enlightenment into experience. It's sort of our first contact with the energy of enlightenment is the desire for it, which is really useful to know that if anybody has the yearning, let's say, for enlightenment, that it's actually coming from the lightened condition that's already inside them. That's why they have the yearning.
그런데 거기서 내가 할 수 있는 게 없는 건 아닌데 서렌더라는 건 서렌더라는 건 완전히 항복하고 포기하는 거 아닌가?
Another paradox too, right? Because there's two kinds of surrender. There's the kind of surrender that we do very consciously, like, okay, we decide, I'll try to let go, right? I will let go. So there's a sort of self-conscious type of surrender, or letting go. That's one kind of surrender. Then there's another kind of surrender that it feels like almost like it happens to you, that you don't do the surrendering, that it's almost the surrendering happens through you. That's a very different kind of surrender, right? So everybody's probably had the experience of consciously or willingly letting go of something. But sometimes we have the experience of a kind of surrender where a let go happens in a way that's much deeper, a deeper surrender, a deeper letting go than our egos could ever manufacture.
그러면 서렌더를 하는 것과 서렌더가 벌어지는 것은 어떤 사람들한테 서렌더가 벌어지는가 하는 게 아니라.
To what kind of people?
어떤 상태일 때.
Yeah. Well, in my experience, I've seen it happen to almost every kind of person you can imagine, and in almost every state you can imagine. I've seen this surrender, this letting go, or this awakening happen in people who were spiritual seekers. I've seen it happen in people who had no interest in spirituality at all. It just sort of happened out of the blue. I've seen people surrender when they're suffering terribly. And I've seen the surrender happen right in the middle of a pretty good life. So there's no set of conditions that you can say are most conducive to surrender. Any standard we set up of what's necessary doesn't ultimately prove to be true, really.
이제 내 질문은 뭐냐면, 물론 그런데 예를 들면 석가모니가 6년 고행을 하고 해볼 걸 했단 말이야.
네.
그리고 나서 보리수 밑에 앉아가지고 자기가 더 이상 할 수 있는 게 없구나라는 것으로 파악하고 이제 내려놓고 정말 내려가서 몸을 추스리면서 목동한테 우유 한 잔 받아먹고 돌아와서 앉았을 때 새벽별을 보면서 뭔가 커다란 폭발이 일어났단 말이지.
네.
그러니까 서렌더라는 것은 지금 말하는 서렌더가 일어나기 위해서는 당신이 해볼 걸 다 해봤을 때 야, 정말 내가 더 이상 할 수 있는 게 없구나라고 나라는 게 할 수 있는 게 없구나 이런 걸 파악했을 때 오는 것을 말하는 거 아닌가?
Yes. Often that's the way it happens. Often the deeper surrender happens after you really put some sincere effort into it. That's often the way it is. Not always. So if we set that up as a standard and say that's the way it always works, I don't think that would be true. But very often, yeah, that's when the deeper surrender happens, when you feel like you've really given everything you have to give.
항상 그렇다고 말할 수 없다는 건 무슨 말이?
Right. Because some people, I've seen people come in to see me the first time they ever come in, and sometimes they'll just open up right on the spot the very first time. You know, they've never done any spiritual practice. That's not the usual way. That's not the way it usually happens, but it does happen that way also. That's why I say we really can't set up any firm standard of what's necessary, because essentially what we're realizing in awakening is what we always were from the very beginning anyway, right? We're not creating a new self. We are discovering our true nature that was there the entire time.
자, 다시 돌아가서 좌선에서 발견한 좌선을 5년 동안 하고 나서 더 이상 내가 할 수 있는 게 없구나, 이게 안 되는구나 이렇게 여겨지고 서렌더를 했을 때 그때 분명히 그런 오랜 기간의 좌선에서 발견하고 얻은 것이 있을 거고 또 안 되는 것이 이런 것은 안 되는구나 이렇게 발견했을 것 같은데 그 두 가지를 좀 얘기해 줄 수 있나요?
Yes. Okay. So before that awakening, I had some little brief glimpses, let's say, of that there was something profound that I could. Every once in a while I'd experience something that seemed very, very profound, just for an instant. A kind of state of being when I would feel much more unified with all of existence. And they would often be very, very brief, come out of nowhere. And after the awakening, the difference was that after the awakening, that what I realized, what I awoke to was, it was no longer a temporary experience. It was something that was simple and obvious. It was just the thing that was very funny about it, which was I realized that what I was, and by the way, what you are, what everybody is this exact same thing as what the Buddha was. And for someone who chased around the Buddha nature for so long, that came as a real surprise. And it was tremendously funny to think that me and the Buddha were essentially, at our essence, the same.
오케이. 내가 묻고 싶은 거는 이거야. 5년간의 자선 동안에, 그러니까 깨어남 이전이지 그때는.
네.
그때도 어쨌든 5년간의 자선 동안에 발견한 것이 뭐 있을 거란 말이지 이게.
아하.
그것과
네.
그 다음에 5년 동안 그렇게 했는데도 이건 안 되는구나 하는 것도 발견된 거잖아.
네.
두 가지가 발견된 것 말이야.
아하.
나 이런 걸 몰랐던 걸 발견했어. 이거 어디 있을 거고 직관이든 무엇이든 통찰이든.
네.
그렇지만 그것이 최종적인 것은 아니니까 내가 원하는 건 최종적인 건데 야, 이 자선을 해서는 되는 건 아니구나 이렇게 발견한 거 아니야.
네네.
이 두 가지를 듣고 싶다는 거야. 그럼 뭐가 안 되는 거구나를 발견한 건지, 그거는 그 다음에 발견한 건 또 그 전에 5년 통해서 발견한 것은 무엇인지. 분명히 있을 거란 말이지. 뭔가 그러니까 그걸 토대로 뭔가 폭발이 일어났을 거 아니냐.
Okay. So the first part, what I came to know in the 5 years of all that practice, what I came to understand was, this is going to sound strange, but what I came to understand was that I didn't understand anything, was I didn't actually know anything. So I didn't acquire more knowledge. That wasn't the foundation. The foundation was that I kept seeing through my knowledge, seeing through my belief systems, seeing through my assumptions, seeing through my conclusions. And so by seeing through all that, it kept showing me how little I actually knew. That was the foundation.
내가 아는 것이 없다는 걸 뭘 아는 게 없다는 거지?
I didn't know who I was.
Who I was?
Yeah, I came to know that I had no real knowledge of who I was. And I came to know that, right? I knew that I didn't know. I didn't know what life really was. I didn't know what death really was. I didn't know what enlightenment was. And those 5 years kept showing me what I didn't know. Right? And so with that, it opens your mind, right? It opens your mind when you don't know. All of spiritual practice is really to open your mind to the unknown. That's what it's for.
그렇다면 5년 동안에 자기가 마음속으로 자선을 하면서 추구한 것은 죽음이 뭔지, 삶이 뭔지, 진정한 깨달음이 뭔지 이런 걸 추구하면서 5년 동안 자선을 했다는 뜻인가? 그런데도 모르겠구나 이런 뜻인가?
Yes. Yeah. And like I said, if you do meditate, something like meditation correctly, if you really look at, okay, who am I? Now let me not sit here and think about it forever, because that's just a bunch of thoughts. What am I underneath my thinking? What am I if I don't refer to a single thought to tell me who I am? Who am I then? Yet all of a sudden, you know that you don't know who you are. All of your knowledge of yourself is only a thought. And whatever you really are, by the very nature of it, must be more than a thought or a collection of thoughts.
뭔가 그런 거 하나 알게 된 거네.
Yes, it's to know what you don't know, which is very, very, very important, is to know what you don't know.
Like Socrates.
Yeah, like a Socrates. So for instance, like a good spiritual question, let's say, a meditative question, who am I? Who am I really? Beyond my thoughts, beyond my ideas, beyond my beliefs, who am I beyond all that? The first thing you come to know is that you don't know. Before you ask that question, you think you know who you are. And as soon as you ask the question, all of a sudden, you know that you don't know. That's what opens you up to awakening.
그러면 그걸 알게 정말 내가 자선을 통해서 그러면 그걸 알게 됐는데 나는 정말 내가 누군지 모르는구나를 알게 됐는데 또 하나 이 자선을 통해서는 진정한 나를 발견할 수 없구나 이걸 알았기 때문에 서른대가 일어났다는 뜻인가?
The surrender was completely opening to the experience of I don't know. Completely opening myself to the experience of I don't know. Because, right, there's the knowledge I don't know, and then there's the experience of I don't know.
아하. 그러니까 일반적으로 안다 모른다를 떠나서 모른다. 그냥 일반적인 모른다는 아니네.
No, right. No, this is very engaged, right? It's not like lazy, like, oh, I don't know anything, so forget it. You know, it's not lazy. It's very, very engaged because you really looked very, very deeply And when you look really deeply at these big issues, these big questions, see and you experience that you don't really know, and that it's something very deep and very shocking.
아하.
You see, we are as human beings, we're very afraid of that degree, that depth of unknown, right? It's very frightening for a human being to experience that degree of the unknown. We just most people will just keep changing from one belief system to another one, and to another one, before they'll finally just let themselves deeply experience, I don't know. I don't know who I am. I don't know what life is. I don't know what's really true. I just don't know. There's a lot of resistance we have to work our way through before we're that open, before we're willing to experience the I don't know in a very deep way.
자, 그 말은 이 모른다가 되면 더 이상 다른 신념으로, 아까 이 신념에서 저 신념으로 보통 넘어간다고 그랬는데,
네.
이 다른 신념으로 넘어갈 때가 없다는 걸 알았을 때 이런 정말 모른다가 생긴다는 건가요? 또는 이러한 정말 모른다를 통해서 더 이상 다른 신념으로 넘어갈 수가 없구나, 이걸 발견한 거예요. 뭔가
두 가지.
또 다른 안다를 위해서 더 이상 찾아가지 않게 되는 거지.
Yes. Yeah. I stopped looking for a new belief. I saw that a new belief is just a new thought. That's all. That's all.
더 이상 갈 데가 없다, 이 말이지.
That's the whole point. Yes. You see, you kind of put yourself in a corner and you can't get out. Right? You can't get out. And it takes a lot of courage to put yourself there and to keep yourself there until you break through.
근데 왜 그때 그러면 그 이후에 폭발이 일어났다 그러는데 왜 그런 골목에 더 이상 갈 데 없는 골목에 부딪히면 폭발이 일어나는 거지?
Why did the experience of explosion happen?
당신이 그 익스플로전이 그때 일어났다고 그런 거 아닌가?
Yes. That was the culmination, I guess you could say. Culmination of I don't know. You see, because this is much deeper than just thought, right? Because the whole ego structure is thought. That's what it is. It's just a bunch of thoughts and images and beliefs. So when that collapsed, when it literally collapses, it released tremendous amount of energy, because it takes a tremendous amount of energy to a lot of energy is tied up in our egoic identities. Tremendous energy is tied up in our egoic identities, and when it's suddenly released, if it gets released all at once, it can feel like an explosion of energy.
그러니까 왜 그때 나는 모른다 하면 에너지가 방출되냐 이 말이야. 묶여있던 에너지가, 그러니까 나는 모른다에 묶여있던 에너지가 폭발한다는 거 아니야. 왜 에서 에너지 폭발로 이어지냐 이 말이지. 그럼 폭발하는 그 에너지는 어디서 생겼냐 이 말이야. That energy was from where?
Yeah, that energy, it's already there. But it's that energy it takes a tremendous energy to keep supporting our separate identities. It takes a lot of energy to do that. So as soon as we go beyond that ego, all of that energy is suddenly released. Right? It's released to the system. Every awakening will have some amount of energetic component. Every awakening has some amount of energetic release of energy that I've ever seen.
오케이. 자, 그러면 한 가지 묻는데, 지금처럼 당신이 5년간 강한 추구력을 가지고 추구했을 때 터져나오는 에너지의 강도하고, 아까 어떤 사람들이 자신한테 와가지고 완전히 마음이 열렸을 때 그 뭐 쉽게 깨어난다 그랬잖아.
네.
뭐 해볼 거 다 안 해보고라도.
네.
그럴 때 그 사람들도 그러면 뭔가를 얻었으니까 에너지를 발생시키겠지.
네.
그때 에너지와는 어떤 차이가 있나?
Good question. Good question. Usually, yes, because the pushing itself, all the striving, builds up a lot of energy. It's right. It's like having a bottle of Coke that you shake and shake and shake and shake, right? And then when you finally pop the top off, all that energy opens up. So sure, a lot of that energy is created by the intensity of the seeking. Yeah.
그러니까 자기를 만나러 와가지고 마음이 열리는 사람들은 그만큼 에너지가 좀 약할 수 있다는 소리네.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yes. My case was a little bit unusual in the sense that the energy was very, very strong. Usually, the energy is not that strong. It's it can be fairly subtle. It can go anywhere from very subtle to very strong, and everything in between.
그래서 당신 같은 경우에는 그 강렬한 에너지를 통해서 뭔가 왔기 때문에 흔들리지 않을 수 있는데 그 약하게 당신을 만나러 와가지고 잠깐 마음이 열려서 영적인 통찰을 한 사람들은 쉽게 흔들리거나 하지는 않습니까?
Sometimes, yes. Sometimes they can be more confused, and also they may or may not value it. Yeah, because they haven't. Because it was just almost like it was just given to them.
Yeah.
And so sometimes they don't value it that much. It's
okay.
It sounds like everything has a bright side and dark side, like
Yes.
upside and downside.
Yes. Even awakening has an upside and a downside. Even awakening, because if you're not ready for awakening, it can really be difficult if you're not ready for it.
Okay.
Yeah. Sometimes it can be very, very disorienting. The worldview changes so much so quickly that it can be really, really disorienting, especially for someone that doesn't have a foundation. I think a lot of spiritual practices are kind of there to create a foundation.
Foundation for
the awakening itself, so you don't get too disoriented. And sometimes awakening will really open the gates of your unconscious. It will really expose your unconscious, and sometimes that can be heavenly, and sometimes that can be very hellish, depending what's in there. It's like everything else in life. It's not without its potential dangers.
Okay. 그러면 두 번째 전환점에 대해서 얘기를 해보시죠.
Okay, I'll say it in small bits this time. Okay. Again, it happened almost as soon as I sat down to meditate. And I heard the sound of a bird, and a question arose spontaneously. Who hears that sound? And as soon as that question arose, all of a sudden there was a flip in consciousness. And all of a sudden I experienced myself to be the bird, the hearing of the bird, and the one that was hearing the bird. It was all experienced to be one event. So the first awakening showed me that I am nothing, and the second awakening showed me that I'm everything. And ultimately, they're the same thing. The something and the nothing and the something are all the same thing ultimately. No, ultimately they're the same.
Mhm.
Little different, they're different experiences, but the nothing and the something is exactly the same. That was one of the fundamental insights of the second one, that emptiness and form are exactly the same thing.
그러면 그 25살의 경험에서 30살의 경험으로 오기까지는 뭘 했습니까?
Well, after the first awakening, it changed my whole spiritual practice because I knew that what I was looking to realize, I already was. I knew that after the first awakening, that I am what I'm seeking.
Okay,
And so,
hold please. hold.
yes.
그 설명해 뭐라고? 거기까지만.
We lost him again.
예.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, I want to hear the experience when you get in 30, 31, 31.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Is that more important?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
What is the essence of it? Let's try. Let's try.
Okay.
So,
The
yeah.
essence of it
Mhm.
would be the experience of unity.
Unity.
Yeah.
Mm.
Everything is actually one thing.
Okay.
That's the experience. And also the experience that it is that all of existence is inside of you.
Inside of you.
Yes.
Okay.
That's,
Then, when you get that experience of unity, before and after, what is the difference in your daily life?
Good question.
Mm.
Because that's different for every person, right? That's
Yes.
different for every person. The difference for me
Yes.
was no fear.
No fear.
No fear. It
Okay.
eliminated fear.
Mm.
No self-consciousness in a way. Well, another way of saying it was just there's a sense, a deep sense of freedom.
Deep sense of freedom.
Of freedom, yeah.
Yes.
It's there throughout the day. It's just
Uh-huh.
part of the atmosphere.
Then, if you don't feel the fear,
선생님 저 돌아왔습니다. 제가 네.
이제 그 두려움이 없다는 것은 더 이상 일상에서 두려움이 없으니까 분노도 표현되지 않는다는 소린가?
No, I can be angry.
왜 그러고 왜 화를 내지? 보통 두려움이 없으면 화가 안 날 텐데.
That's not my experience. I don't get angry very often. It's hard to explain a kind of, let's say, anger, for instance, that doesn't feel divided. But usually the experience of anger feels like conflict. But it doesn't have to feel that way. It's very hard to explain to somebody what that's like. Very, very hard to explain what that's like.
예를 들어서 구체적인 상황으로 한번 설명해 줄 수 있을까요?
I'm trying to remember an example. It's been a while. It's been a while. I don't know, quite honestly, if I can remember a specific example. 'Cause it's been a long time.
그러면 최근 6개월간 한 번도 화를 낸 적이 없습니까? 5월 1년.
I'm sure I have. I know the next question is going to be, what was it about? So that's the problem. I have to remember that.
잊어버리는 거 쉽게 잊어버리는군요.
Very easily.
Okay.
It's like every experience, every emotion is like a wind. It just comes through and then it's gone.
Okay.
It doesn't leave any residue.
Okay. 그래서 한번 기억해낼 수 있습니까?
I'm trying.
어렵지 않으면 됩니다.
No, I'm really trying to remember. I'm not trying to avoid the question. I don't want to make anything up. It has to be real. I can't come up with a specific example. I really wish I could for you. I mean, I think this is an example of me, but an example of this is like, Jesus could be very angry at times, especially when he encountered injustice or the abuse of power. He had a response to that, and sometimes sometimes part of that response was anger, because sometimes the moment calls for that, right?
Okay.
See, my experience is that when this experience of freedom goes very deep, what you're liberated from is the experience of internal conflict. But that does not mean that you suddenly become incapable of having certain experiences. You just experience them without the conflict.
Sorry, I didn't understand. Can you repeat that again, please?
My experience of this kind of freedom is that it's not so much that you no longer experience certain emotions. It's that you don't experience conflict with them. See, people think that an enlightened person is only going to experience peace and happiness and joy. And they think every other negative emotion will be eliminated from their experience. This I don't think it's true.
Okay.
When there's no internal conflict, there's far less negative experience. There's far less. But that doesn't mean that they're no longer capable of having such experiences.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. By the way, wonderful questions. Very wonderful questions. Very deep questions that you're asking. Yeah, I really appreciate these. Are very deep questions.
Yes. So I want to quest deeply.
Yeah.
And then get subtle meaning from your experience.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm
glad to see you.
I'm glad to see you too. It's like